Daigo said this the other day. He's like, PC online is better than PS4 offline. And it's like, yeah, if you've got your connection really dialed in, that's where you go. And so for the people who are like, just make the netcode better, that's not a thing. You've got to make specific instances better. You've got to make the game handle them better. And that's actually the whole point of this video. If those inputs are not going to be ever factored into the gameplay unless it's in a negative way of causing latency, why don't you just throw those out in some situations where it's like, if this is only going to cause problems, like if you're on the ground, like say your character's in the Okazemi situation, right? And there's nothing you can do. No inputs are going to matter at all until you get up to a certain point. If you just basically disable or have those inputs throttled at that point in time, where if someone's mashing like crazy and they're not factoring in, like, and you just throw them out, then there's no loss. Like, you don't lose anything at that point. No one's losing anything except for latency issues. I want to talk about 3 major problems with Street Fighter V's netcode that I want fixed. And these are recurring issues with the game. I play on a pretty good connection. I've got a strong PC, and yet these issues come up repeatedly, which makes me think that the way the game handles some of these things should change in the future. But before we get into it, I just want to ask everyone to leave a like on this video if they don't mind. Slipknot the video, Psycho Crush it if you don't mind. It helps out the channel a ton.
If you didn't see the previous video where we explained the Slipknot thing, it's because their song Psychosocial, John originally mistook to hear, he heard Psycho Crusher, and that's what that is, just so as you guys know.
You need to replace John with everyone. Every Street Fighter fan heard Psycho Crusher. That song is called Psycho Crusher. It's not Psychosocial. So anyway, Slipknot, please rename that song to what it should be. But I'm going to try to keep from getting super technical here when I explain netcode issues. I do have programming background, I'm a Python programmer, stuff like that. So I know some of this stuff, but I'm going to lose everyone if, oh yeah, evil. But anyway, I'm going to lose everyone if I get into like too heavy of technical details. It's going to be more of a light discussion on it. Number one problem I have with the game, shimmies with buttons. The bottom line is the game does not handle it well when players move back and forth and hit buttons from a close range. Street Fighter V decides kind of like how large or how not to make the input delay based on players' connections. And in this clip that we're showing here, Cammy's crouching medium punch hits Rose 2 frames later in the input replay, which is just going into CFN, watching your replays without any kind of thing, versus the online version, which I recorded directly as it was happening. And you can see with the clip playing here, we've slowed it down, said slow motion, but there's also here a graphic we're going to flash up here that's easier to see. 2 frames earlier online, that Cammy's crouching medium punch hit me than it did in the replay and stuff. So 2 frames of input delay is generally not too bad when playing online, but the problem comes in when you start seeing leg spikes and such. This tends to happen a lot when your opponent is moving frequently. Shimmies are really effective in Street Fighter V, and so you see quite a few latency
Super
problems
prominent.
because of it.
Super prominent. Yeah. Shimmies, I didn't even consider shimmies to the capacity that I did while playing through all of Street Fighter 4. There were better options for the most part, and then all of a sudden 5 comes out and it becomes an incredibly powerful tool because I think no options like grab counters and things like that. But yeah, it's like rarely does a match go by where you don't see at least 1 or 2 shimmies.
And if that is a dominant style of how your game is played, you need to code your netcode to accommodate that a little bit better. And so when I'm playing Dream King here, I told him to just do a lot of back and forth with Cammy. Cammy's got a really fast walk speed, hit a bunch of random buttons, and he consistently would lose some animation frames in the process. Or I get hit at funky times in places where I'm like, half animated on my end, and it just hits me, the 2 frames earlier than I'm like, it becomes really hard to react to stuff. And when you have something that's really good and really hard to react to, it becomes a dominant way to play the game. And it's like, okay, you've got to spend extra time on your netcode there and make sure that your netcode is keeping pace with what your players are doing. That is so important. If you've designed something to be a crucial part of it, it better be optimized to the hell online. And one of the ways that they could do that is it's very rare for when someone's pressing forward or back to hold it that input for just a single frame. right?
Yeah.
Like usually they're going to be holding back or forward for a handful of frames. And so what the netcode could do is it could say like, okay, if you're holding forward, I'm going to assume that you're going to be holding forward for a few frames of time and kind of basically predict that movement for you and smooth out the animation a little bit more. Instead of going, okay, maybe you're only holding forward for a frame and maybe the game already does this, it just doesn't do a good enough job consistently with handling it. There are ways of coding your netcode so that it's actually imperceptible, some of the lag spikes that you will get if you code it in some of these ways, and it can have drawbacks, but if you do it in the right way and test it up enough, like you can make this work. And it's something I've heard with other games that they've done, especially with rollback code. Again, it comes down to really predicting what the players are going to do and predicting it in very intelligent ways.
Hmm. I have a question because I'm coming from the corner of like, the not too tech savvy, we're Necalli players, group. So please, but so when someone's designing netcode for a game, people talk about it to the level of like, well, make it better, make it faster. Is there sort of an approach that like kind of like the not a switch, but like, we can make the whole thing just generally better. It's faster, the
Yeah,
speed back and forth.
yeah.
That's not a thing. So when
It's
someone
not
talks
humanly
about
possible.
making
Yeah.
netcode better, what they're really talking about is going into like the little nuances of the interactions like you're talking about here and basically tailor making them to be especially efficient.
Yes, that is the definition of netcode. And the only way to speed up internet connections, like what you're talking about, is literally to get a better connection. Which there's plenty of people in the FGC, and I play plenty of them online where they really don't give two craps about their connection. It's they have not put in the time and other stuff in there, and it's like and there's plenty who do, right? I've certain people I played online, and Daigo said this the other day. He's like, PC online is better than PS4 offline. And it's like, yeah, if you've got your connection really dialed in, that's where you go. And so for the people who's like, just make the netcode better, that's not a thing. You've got to make specific instances better. You've got to make the game handle them better. And that's actually the whole point of this video is I
Mhm.
kind of wanted to educate people a little bit more and get them a little bit more kind of looking into it. Like I said, not super technical, but yes.
I mean, if I were going off of what people tend to, how they talk about it on social media and such, I thought Capcom just needed to turn up the netcode knob, and like that's yeah, that's the level of resolution you often hear people talk about.
Yeah.
Like, make the netcode better,
Yeah,
just
I
do
mean,
it.
in a way, yeah. I mean, it's like optimize more parts of the netcode, sure, kind of thing. It's asking for the same thing. It's just maybe articulating it a little bit better is what people should be doing. But and again, the best way of doing that is often this is rollback code. Basically, takes all the latency and takes it from instead of happening on the front end of things, it happens on the back end.
Mm.
And with that, you want to do a lot of predictions on what you think players are going to do. So correctly predicting what a player is going to probably do will actually smooth out a lot of rough edges on your netcode. Because it's like, well, if 99.9% of the cases a player does exactly this and we just apply this rule to it, it's like, oh, all of a sudden, like, even if lag happens in that spot, it's going to be masked by really good netcode.
When
It's
you have
not going to
something
be
like
that big of an
Shimmy
issue.
in a game like Street Fighter 5, that's a place where you can really hedge your bets.
Exactly. And that brings us now to the second thing, and that is dashing. When characters have long distance, fast moving dashes, the game seems to have trouble properly predicting where they're going to end up. And the example that we're showing here with Necalli, which is literally nothing but a dash with no attack happening, and you can see the game glitching out and going, because Necalli pops his V trigger. If that happens on PlayStation, you might as well just shut your console off because it can't handle it. But even on the PC, there's a lot of stuff going on, and Necalli just basically outright skips some of the animation frames for a moment. And in this game, when you are trying to correctly read against, the dash, strike, jump mix up, losing animation frames and having them jank out for a minute is really disruptive.
Mm.
And it causes them to teleport. It's not a good look. And basically, what you want to do to fix this is actually, again, adjust the game's code to basically correctly predict where Necalli is going to be at and maybe even adjust how dashes work so that some of the animations aren't like just kind of like going to cause the game's code to glitch out. And changing how dashes would work could be a problem in this game because it's like, okay, dashes have always worked this way since day one, and now you're changing them up a little bit. So maybe the startup is a little bit more, and the recovery frames are a little bit less, or vice versa, right? That is a way of changing up how dashes work that could potentially make them not glitch out in this situation. That could have repercussions on the gameplay, but in my opinion, that's a good repercussion to have because anything you do to smooth out the gameplay online, where most people are playing this game, is a good choice to make. And so that's one way of solving it. But I know people, and I'm talking to a player who prefers to play offline. Like, you start talking about the offline competitive community there, you start talking about changing dashing at this point in the game, and people might go kind of crazy. But I wondered how you felt about that, John. Like, what are your reactions to that?
So you're saying change the way things work for Street Fighter 5. This isn't even for like the
Both.
future.
Well,
Okay.
yeah, this would be changing not only how dashing works, but also optimizing the netcode around it too. Doing a twofold approach to basically make this. It would still be good. It would still probably have the exact number of frames, but just like where the recovery and startup and other stuff like that of the dash happens might be changed a little
I
bit.
would have to see it put in practice and I would have to feel it in my hands to give you, as good of an answer that I could. My initial inclination right now is to say that's a bit much considering where Street Fighter 5 is right now. If you change the way something like dashes feel and operate, even there is some buffer, there's some wiggle room there, but not a lot.
Yeah,
And that's like, certain V triggers are, big problems still, and you can't just say, well, maybe they should just turn off a V trigger. It's like this is sort of in that kind of camp at this point. It's like it's possible. I wouldn't write it off, but I'd like to see how it looks and feels in my hands before I can make that call. Something as integral and as common as dashing, though, it's like that's a pretty tall
big
ask.
deal.
So I have some reservations, but I'm not gonna flat out say no.
Yeah, and that's how come I think Capcom's in the same camp as you. It's like they're like, we could alter some of this stuff, but you kind of want that baked in from close to day one, and you want to make your game run so it runs well online, right? If you base your entire game around running online and running it well, that's a big deal. And so I think this is something maybe they'll look at for the future, and not so much like a current game, but it's still something I want them keeping an eye on because dashing has been a problem. I think with most rollback code games, like any move that you have that moves you across the screen a heavy distance, if you haven't properly coded around it, it can cause a lot of issues.
I gotta say, like the most recent time I played heavily online was in a tournament, and one of Luke's combos, the character I'm playing right now, one of his combos ends with a forward dash into a DP, as do some of his corner situations where you're ending the combo with a DP juggle, and just trying to hit that like in that tournament, I missed it, and it was like I did the input and I felt it and it felt right. Feels like what you're doing in training mode, but then you see it play out in front of you and it's just a frame or two behind, but that's all the difference in the world between
Yeah.
finishing your combo and getting crush countered. And when you get crush countered, that just deposits into your mind and you go, okay, now I'm playing with this little 1, 2, 3, 4 frame delay. Now that affects every decision and every movement that I'm making, and it affects my confidence in my decisions and in my movements there on out. It's a really bad look. So if something like dashing is where the issue is, as you're saying, and could get fixed, that would be amazing. But again, I'm looking for Street Fighter 6. I think the experiment has been run with 5. It's like let's just make things better in the future.
Yeah. And that brings us to our third and final thing. This one is well documented, and that is mashing inputs and directions causing latency. This is something that you and Dream King actually did a full out article on, and then other players have complained about it and stuff. But basically, mashing a bunch of buttons and joystick directions causes some real big issues with this game, and the game gets stuck trying to capture all the inputs and then sending them at a rapid pace, like through your internet. Like, so if you inputted, like, let's say 40 inputs in, like, 3 seconds or something crazy like that, like that's a lot to be sending through the pipeline and your internet connection and getting reflected through on the other end. And so my solution would actually be to have some kind of throttle in there where when it's clear the other player is just mashing, like, again, using that example of setting like 40 inputs over like 3 seconds or something like that, like you would basically dump the last like 20 inputs are, there's 20 of those inputs, 30 of those inputs, and only process the most current ones up to a certain threshold, basically. You would throttle how many inputs would actually come through. And I know that the FGC is going like, hey, like, don't ever, drop inputs. Like, don't ever have that happen and stuff like that. And I understand that that can be a thing, but the thing about it, if those inputs aren't going to be a factor at all, if those inputs are not going to be ever factored into the gameplay unless it's in a negative way of causing latency, why don't you just throw those out in some situations where it's like, if this is only going to cause problems, like if you're on the ground, like say your character's in the Okazemi situation, right? And there's nothing you can do, no inputs are going to matter at all until you get up to a certain point. If you just basically disable or have those inputs throttled at that point in time, where if someone's mashing like crazy and they're not factoring in, like, and you just throw them out, then there's no loss. Like, you don't lose anything at that point. No one's losing anything except for latency issues.
I mean,
And
that
that would be a
sounds like
way
a
of,
perfect world for sure. And you know more about all of this stuff and how it works than I do. But I've been around for a couple decades now, and in a lot of things like this that I would liken to, what it would go into programming and then all the ripple effects of all this. It sounds to me like some of these fixes, like I'm afraid of because maybe they fix one thing but they cause a whole bunch of other issues. It's like the
that's
game
programming.
zeroes in.
Yes.
Yeah, and I've heard you talk about programming before.
Yeah.
You cover one thing and that just opens up six other doors for crap to happen.
Yeah.
And but yeah, like I see that. It's like, so what does that look like in the situation where there's a knockdown or maybe there's like a stun? I mean, people have been be able to predict when people are going to mash online and notice like the slowdown, right, when there's a stun or when there's a particularly dire situation. A lot of times, regularly online players will stop their combo and let the person DP that they know that they're mashing out and then finish them off that way because it's more effective. But point is, it's like every time you get into one of those situations, does the game identify it and then go into this sort of special dropped inputs mode? And then does that dropped
Yes.
inputs mode ever activate when it's not supposed to activate? And what does that look like? It just sounds like a lot of additional like Hydra heads might be popping up after this one.
That's well. Keep in mind that the game already does this in a lot of scenarios. That's what netcode is as a basis. Not necessarily this exact example, but the game will look at situations like Okazemi or rounds ending and other stuff like that, and either cut out inputs or do other things depending on what's happening. That's the whole basis of netcode. But you're 100% right. Where if you do too many tweaks or you do them in the wrong way, the unintended consequences surfaced, right? And that can cause a lot of issues. And as was footage we're showing here with Bison, who has maybe the most spammy V trigger in the entire game, because you just literally wiggle the joystick left and right and hit crouching light punch, and it'll do combos and stuff. It's a great way to kind of get things out there. It also is a great way to cause latency in the game because of the way that the move animates. It's a combination of the move animating kind of funky, and then all the inputs that come through. And damn, does that ever thing. That stupid V trigger is one of the worst designed things in Street Fighter 5, if not the hands down worst itself. It's really bad. And Capcom, I don't often put them on blast because Street Fighter 5 is my favorite game, but that whoever designed that and left that in the game should be ashamed of themselves, because they should have spotted that from the get-go playing on PlayStation and been like, yeah, we can't do this. We need to rework how this move works. And it's like I said, this is mostly a Street Fighter 6 thing because it's a lot of this stuff needs to go hand in hand with how the moves work and other stuff, but these are potential solutions here. This is really about talking about Street Fighter V's current set of issues, and then like kind of what we want to see happen in the future, because the game is probably done. If we get a netcode update, I would be shocked, but we'll probably get some balance updates and a few other things in there. But what would be really upsetting to me is if this stuff is prevalent in Street Fighter 5 and it's prevalent in Street Fighter 6. I'd be like, okay, that's showing me you guys did not learn from your mistakes, but also the community did not get out there and talk enough about what these specific issues are. And so I wanted to make sure that we jumped on this today and like, here's specific issues, and there's plenty more of them out there. Feel free to document them in the comments, anywhere else. We'll be checking them out and trying to get this kind of back over to Capcom so that this stuff can get fixed in the future and we all have a better experience for it.
Mm.